Hello and welcome to a chapter on business continuity. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the different types of environmental controls, describe the components of the redundancy planning. You have to have some backups just in case. And we'll talk about the DRP, the disaster recovery plan. And we'll talk about, at the end, we'll discuss the incident response procedures. What should you do when there's a problem, when something happened? What are the steps you should take? All right, what is business continuity? The whole idea is to make sure that the business or the organization that you are working for, they are either if something happened, the business can keep going without any interruptions, with minimal interruptions. So examples for if you have a power outage or a hurricane or a tsunami, do you have some place to go? Do you have backups? Do you have UPS systems? Do you have generators? Is there another place that you can go to? Are there computers? How long is it going to take? All of that needs planning, and depending on where you are and what's the probability of maybe an environmental um, attack may happen. So what are you going to do? Okay. So business continuity planning and testing steps are extremely important. So please write down this point down here, the business continuity planning and testing steps. You have to identify exposure to the threats, create a preventive and recovery procedures, and test those procedures to determine if they are sufficient. All right, so one of the first thing you want to do is to create a business impact analysis, the BIA. And please write that point down. That's important because you need to analyze the most important business functions and quantify the impacts of their loss, identifies the threat through risk assessment, and determine the impact of the threats are realized. So you need to take a look at the inventory of everything that you have and which part of your organization are extremely important in terms of devices or even employees or servers, workstations, the building, if the company owns it, and what are the threats? Is it a hurricane? Are we next to the oceans? There may be, in an area where there's a lot of earthquakes or tsunamis, hurricanes, like I said earlier. It could be a power outage, snowstorms, a lot of snowstorms that you may not have access to your facilities. And what is the impact is going to be? Is it going to cost us a lot of money? How much if we don't have access to the building for 2 or 3 weeks? What's going to happen? What can we do? Right? How can you mitigate against these attacks? So you need to you need to gather all of that information from the upper management or from the employees. You're going to ask them questions. What happens if you don't have access to your resources for a day or two or weeks? And and ask them. You can even ask them questions on, what can we do? What do you think is the best way to get around it? Right? And here are some of the questions that the interview forms that you can actually use. So you want to gather all of that information, and of course, you discuss that with the upper management and the presidents of the company, and they come up with a plan with a DRP, a disaster recovery plan. So you also need to calculate, by the way, that's another note, the mean time to restore. How long is it going from when a disaster happens? How long is it going to take you to bring things back up to normal, right? That's the MMTR. Measures the average time needed to reestablish services. So the disaster recovery activities, also write that point down, is you need to create, implement, and test disaster recovery plans. It is not good enough just to create the plan and discuss it without actually solving the problem, don't know how to restore to get back into action. All right, so you got to get back into action as quickly as possible. All right, the DRP, the disaster recovery plan, has to be written and it has to be communicated to all the employees, and it has to be tested, right? And you can set it into three different levels. The educational DRP, you can do level one, two, and three, and you can do, level one, the central computer resources. Level two could be the campus network infrastructure, and level three could be the risk was specific to a unique users. So you could do, you have to go through all three different levels when you're doing the DRP. All right, so what should be features in the DRP? Well, you should define a plan, purpose, and scope, the recovery plan team, who's going to be doing what, list of the risks and procedures, outline the emergency procedures, and detailed restoration procedures. What are you going to do? All of that has to be written down in the DRP. All right, so write down these points on what the DRP should have. All right, these are typical example of it. It has to be the DRP has to be adaptable. You have to have some contingency options. Again, you have to do the if a plan and respond is not working properly, technology is rolled back to a starting point. You have to start all over if it doesn't work. You have to be tested every once in a while, and employees needs to know about that. You could do it in webinars, by the way. It doesn't have to be, but they have to know. But the team has to actually practice and make sure everything's up to par. Okay, now let's talk about single point of failure. A single point of failure, which is a point that I want you to write down, is the component or entity which will disable the entire system if no longer functions. So when we're coming to a network, if you are on a network, probably the switch, for example, will be a central point of failure. Because if the switch fails, everybody that's connected to the switch goes out of service. Um, it could be the building is a central point of failure. If you can't have access to the building because the heat is out, or the air conditioning, or there is no internet connection, then everybody is out. You have to be able to remove the single point of failure. You have to have redundancies. So for the building, maybe what happens if we don't have access to a building? Can we go somewhere else? For example, if we can't use a classroom, we should have another contingency where we can use another classroom on the fly where it has computers and access to the internet. If not, maybe there's another backup. Maybe you could do it remotely, right? Nowadays, we can do the class from home, for example. So you have to have those backups just in case, right? A switch, you may have to have a backup switch just in case. Default gateways when you're trying to access the internet. Links between trunks between switches or routers when we're when we're on the network. You should have those redundant links. If one breaks, the system will automatically reconfigure itself and reroute you, right? All this redundancy is extremely important. On your hard drive, if your hard drive fails, for example, you should have another backup that would immediately take over. And we can set all of that up, and that is all doable. Now, so here's the downtime. If your system operates at 90% of the time and fails 10%, in a year time, you're going to lose 336 days of work. That's a lot. That's if you're only operating at 90%. If you're operating at the quad 9, for example, you're only down, 56 minutes, 52.56 minutes a year, which is not bad. So when you're getting ISPs, you want to either look for the quad or the 6 nines, right? I mean the fives or the 6 nines. Look at the 6 nines. You're down to like 31 seconds a year. Now, for example, if you have, I'll give you an example where this could be very helpful. If you bought a car and your car is 90% reliable, which means 10% of the time it fails on you, whatever, because you have, not a pretty good an old car, right? A very old car. And let's say this is the only car you have to go to work. So 10% of the time you won't be able to go to work. You're going to miss, if you work every day, let's say, you're going to miss 36.5 days. Excuse me. If you buy another car, exactly the same car with the exact same reliability at 90%, and you just let it sit in your driveway and don't use it, just use it for backup, then your reliability goes up to 99%. So instead, you may only use 3 days instead of 36 days. So your improvement becomes much, much better because the likelihood that both cars are going to be disabled at the same time is becomes much, much less. Of course, if one car fails and you're using the other one, you want to get the other one fixed, right? To have it back, to sit idle and wait for you just in case something goes wrong. Just don't let it go, right? Redundancy and fault tolerance. So redundancy is having, you know, the physical device such as hard drive, links, switches, buildings there. Fault tolerancing mean, it has to tolerate the failure. So if a hard drive fails, for example, your operating system will immediately switch to the other backup drive. If a link fails, your operating system on the switch of the router will immediately use the other link to go. That's fault tolerance. It can tolerate a failure so that there's no disruption to the user. The users will still have access to the resources regardless, right? And you have to set all of that up. So what you could do is you could use server cluster to do that. So write that down, please. Server cluster is the multiple servers that appear to be as a single server connected through public or private cluster connection. You could do that in the cloud. So you can, when you're accessing your server as a user, you don't see it. All you see is the server that you're accessing to. But if that server fails, you immediately go to another server as a backup, and you won't even have any disruptions whatsoever. All right. So there are two types of cluster servers, asymmetric and symmetric. Asymmetric servers perform no function except to be ready. They just sit there, they sit idle, use data, and just in case something goes wrong, they come online. Okay. So if one server fails, the remaining servers will take over. And you could do that through VPNs. So here's a typical cluster service that you can use. Hard drives. When it comes to hard drive space, if you are purchasing the old hard drive, not SSDs, most hard drive manufacturers from Seagates to Western Digitals, what they do is they they go on the hard drive, excuse me, let me clean my throat, and they type in the MTBF number, the mean time before failure. So what they're going to do is, by the way, write this down and listen to what I'm telling you while you're writing it down. Excuse me. So what they do when they manufacture the hard drive is they take your hard drive and they run it till it fails. They keep running it 24/7 till eventually fail because hard drive will fail. There are electromechanical devices. This is not the solid state hard drives. We're talking about the ones that have platters and the arms that goes to read and write on those platters, on those plates. So those arms that keeps going back and forth, they are enabled by electricity and eventually will break from wear and tear. They'll go on top of those plates and they'll scratch them and you'll have failure. So you need to know when they are going to fail so you'll have a backup or how long they are going to run for. So the manufacturers will run these drops till they fail. They run several of them and they take the average of the time it took to fail. That's the MTBF number. Average means the mean. Mean means average. The mean time before failure, for example, if it's 50,000 hours, They stamp that number on the drive. So when you buy it, they tell you the average time that this hard drive will run is for 50,000 hours. After that, we cannot guarantee it. So you want to buy a hard drive with a high MTBF number. Now, also what you could do is you could use the RAIDs drives, the redundant array of independent devices. So the RAID uses multiple hard disk drives to increase the reliability of and performance. There are 5 levels of RAIDs. So let's go through each one, the ones that are important. Level 0, which I want you to write down, the strip disk array without fault tolerance. Stripping partitions on the hard drive into smaller sections. So with RAID 0, what they're going to do, you're going to have several hard drives like this. And what they do when you come in to save data on the server, the data is sent to the controller. The controller will take the data, put it in 4 different places. Some here, some there, some here, and some there, and just alternate between the 5 drives. And the idea is if one drive fails, we got most of the data left. It's not really for tolerance RAID 0. So, but you're alternating. You're not putting the data all in one place. That's RAID 0. Not a lot of people like that. RAID 1 is mirroring. Actually, duplexing is the most widely used. So please write that down. Again, RAID 1 is when you have 2 hard drives. I'm just going to go forward. You guys can write it down and then continue with me. So what you're going to do is you're going to write the data on these 2 disks and immediately mirror. This is mirror drives, by the way, RAID 1 mirroring. And just copy everything onto the other 2 drives. These 2 drives only get copies. Is just a mirror image of the primary ones. And the idea, if this fails, the primary drives or any of them fail, immediately the operating system knows and to go to the mirrored, and the mirror kicks in immediately. All servers have to have mirrored drives, or actually duplexes. The problem with mirrored is if the controller fails, then you don't have access to the primary or the mirrored ones, and that's not good. Duplexing, on the other hand, will have 2 sets. Each, the primary and the secondary, or the mirrored one, will have their own controller. So this will completely separate. RAID 5. RAID 5 is when is the independent disk with distributed parity. So write this down too. RAID, just the RAID 5, not 0+1. I don't know if they actually do that anymore. It does distribute the parity for error checking across all drives, and data is stored on one drive and the parity information is stored on the other. So what happened is, for example, parity, just to let you know, let's say you have an 8-bit number and it's 00110001. So you count the number of ones in this byte, and there are 3 of them, 3 ones in there, and that's an odd number. Number 3 is an odd. So the parity, if it's an odd parity, I'll have another bit in addition to the 8-bit number, and I'll put a 1 in there. A 1 means that the number of ones in this 8-bit number is odd, and you save both of them, the parity number 1 and the 8-bit number. So when you come to retrieve the data, before you retrieve the data, you retrieve the data and you count the number of ones. If it's odd and the parity tells you that it's odd, then the data is good. If you have an even number, let's say you have 4 ones when you retrieved it, when you compared it with the parity tells you, it's a 1 in there, it tells you that it should be odd, but you counted an even number of ones, you know that the data is corrupted. You understand? So it's not 100% bulletproof, but that's how parity works, to give you, some sort of, because sometimes when you save the data on a hard drive, one of the bits could go to 0, it's supposed to be 1, or 1 could be a 1, it's supposed to be 0 because the space on the hard drive was corrupted. So what they do is they take the parities, they put them in one location on one drive and the actual data on another. So this way, the parity, most likely both of these locations are not going to fail at the same time. If one fails, the other one, but if they compare and they're both good, then your data is okay. That's the idea behind parity and hard drive. That's not being used as much. The most widely used is RAID 1 with disks duplexing on the server's end. I don't know anyone that actually installs servers without using RAID 1, either mirroring or duplexing. All right, so here is 0 plus 1. They do stripping and mirroring at the same time. That's probably used the 0, 1, RAID 0, 1. But that's a little bit too much, maybe. I don't know. I don't use that. I used the duplexing when I was in the early days in the 1990s when we were setting up servers. We use disk duplexing all the time when we're setting up the server. You can actually do server mirroring too. I know a company wanted that, so they purchased exactly two servers. I think when we're running Novell in like 95, 96, I think, if I was not mistaken, and they mirrored the servers. If anything goes wrong with the server, the other server picks up immediately. All right, so that's that with redundant hard drives, redundant networks. So even networks have to be backed up nowadays. If your network fails and you don't have access to it. By the way, now there's the um, software-defined network (SDNs) that a lot of service providers offer you. So you don't even have to have your own network now. It's in the cloud. So if you need a network, they'll have your server, all the users, anything that you want to access. All you need is a username and a password, and you are in. You don't need the hardware, and you just pay a fee for the service. You got all the redundancies, all the backups. You're always good to go. So the SDNs are a growing. It's a growing big market nowadays for the service providers to save because everything is going to be done in the cloud, right? SDNs is a hard growing field. That's probably something that you should be looking at. But if you still, some companies may still want the physical access to their devices. They want to have control over the hardware, but that means they're going to have the personnel to take care of it, and they have to, you know, own if there's any failures. So they have to set up all the redundancies themselves in terms of the network, the hardware, everything. So you have to have an uninterrupted power supply. You could either have an offline UPS, charged by the main power supply and begin supplying power when the primary fails. It just sits there and waits. It's really a battery that is a charged battery, and if there's a blackout, immediately within 15 milliseconds the UPS kicks in. Or you could have it online, running directly connected to your device. And the UPS, the line goes into the UPS, and from the UPS, you charge let's say, you're connected to your server. The UPS will sense the blackout, and the UPS will just kicks in immediately and keeps the server running. Typically, that's what you want to do. But remember, the UPS is only there temporarily. It's not gonna, it's a battery. It's not gonna last forever. So if you need something that's gonna last forever, you're probably gonna need a generator. And generator needs gas, some of them. And if it's a hurricane, you may not have access. So a lot of people may want to get propane generators that will kick in and power not only their servers, we're talking about your whole house or the building themselves. But depending on where you are, if let's say you live in a state where they are prone to a lot of hurricanes, that's probably an investment that you should think about. But if you live in a place where there's hardly ever any hurricanes, where you may, or hardly any other blackouts, you know, That's probably, that's something that you may think about. Maybe you just want to take care of, maybe you'll use a UPS instead of a generator. All right. So please write down online UPSs. So you can write just down this, the first point, and backup generators, because I want you to think about those. Also, sites. I want you to write down the three different types of sites for backups in case you don't have access to your sites. There is the hot site, the warm, and the cold. The hot is means that you have exactly a duplicate of the place that you are working at. For example, a classroom with computers and access to the internet. So if you don't have access to this classroom, you'll be able to move to the other another classroom, and you don't have to do much to get set up, right? Everything is right there for you, right? That's a hot site. A warm site, all the equipment there, but it needs a little bit of a setup. So write that down, right? All the equipment installed, but you need to, you need some time to get back things together. A cold site is just a room, nothing in there. But you have to have at least one of those three, right? You can't just assume, or you could just tell everybody you could do work from home and we can do it in the cloud nowadays. It's a little bit easier. So that could be another option for you if you can set that up. But you have to have one of those options, and the employees needs to know that this is what we're going to do if something goes, and if we don't have access to your physically to your offices. What are you going to do? You have to have a plan, either hot, cold, warm, or online. Data backups. Okay, if your data is not backed up to the cloud with a third-party service, you need to back them up yourselves. Here's one thing that for many years, I'll never forget. I read an article, and it's probably true, that most people back up their data. Here's the problem. They back up their data. 70% of the people know the procedures on how to back up the data, the IT. And 70% also do not know how to store it because they never tried. They never did. They just know how to do the backups. It's a daily routine or a weekly routine, and they never encountered. And the problem, when the problem occurs and they need to restore the data, it's a mess. But the whole idea of backing up the data is to be able to get the data back and get it up and running as quickly as possible. So if you are responsible for backing up the data, here's what I want you to do. Write these points down. Make sure you back up the data into two different places on a non-removable media, maybe DVDs or even external hard drive, and put those removable data somewhere else, non-removable data. Don't leave them next to the server, the ones that you backed up. Get them out of the room because if the server, there's fire or anything, you lose both. And also nowadays, the second thing I want you to do is I want you to back them up into another place, maybe in the cloud somewhere that is far away from the building, in a different geographic areas, right? So this way, in case something goes wrong, it's just a matter of time to restore everything. Now, how often should you back up? So there are three different ways, the three different backups, and I want you to write these down. There is the full backup, the differential, and the incremental. Let me explain each one of them. You can write them down as I explain them if you want. The, when you save data on the hard drive, before we get into that, let me explain something to you first. When you save data on the hard drive, every single file will have an attribute next to it called the archive bit, and it turns on. It have a 1 next to it. If the archive bit is 1, it's telling you that this file has not been backed up. When you back up the file, the operating system will change the attribute, the archive attribute, to 0. So if you take a look at the file attribute, the archive bit, and if it's 0, you know that this file has been backed up. If it's a 1, that means it has not been backed up. Okay? So when you want to back up your server, your operating system will go and back up everything and will change the archive bit to 0. So that's when you do full backup. So doing full backup is taking every single file, saving it, and changing the archive bits to 0. Once you do that, then you immediately go, and if any, and then you also do incremental. So typically, full backup is done with incremental backup. Incremental backup it will only back up the ones that have changed. Their bits are, it only backs up the one where their archive bit is a 1. So for example, after you do a full backup, let's say you saved files or you installed new files or applications, and they have their archive bits 1 goes to 1, right? So at the end of the week, every Friday, you do an incremental backup after you did that full. And so the incremental will go and look for all the new files that have the archive bit 1 and back them up only. So typically full backup and incremental work together. You do one full backup and incremental, maybe you do it periodically every week or so. Differential backup, on the other hand, backs up everything regardless of what the archive bit is. So you could do that maybe once a week. At the end of the week, you back up everything regardless. But that takes a little bit of time. You want to do it on a Friday, maybe after work. It backs up everything. Um, what's the most widely used? I've seen both. But people prefer full and incremental because it's easier. But I'm telling you, the most important thing is you have to practice restoring. You have to know how to restore the data from a backup media, right? Believe it or not, a lot of people don't know how to do it. They know it's easy to back up, but it may be a little bit more challenging to restore because you're under pressure to get things up and running as quickly as possible. Okay, so that's that. As long as you type this in, then you're fine. You could type this in instead if you want to. This from what I said. If you don't write that down, you probably want to write down this chart instead. Okay, so you have to also make sure that you want to take a look at the recovery point objective, the maximum length of time an organization can tolerate between backups. That's why where the pressure comes in to be able to restore the data. They want you to bring things every up as quickly as possible. So again, if you're responsible for backups, restoring is even more important because that's when it counts. And you want to be able to look at the length of time it will take to recover the backup data. Okay. Magnetic tape drives are really no longer in use. There's still some around though. They can store a lot of data for you, but they are vulnerable to dust, dirty, and their magnet and the corruptions. Oh my God, what a headache! When I worked at IBM, it was a big, big headache. Those backup tape drives. All right. Again, nobody uses them. Make sure you use RAID drives like we discussed earlier. We talked about that. Okay, that's not important. Um, so what should you, how do you do backup? You can use a third-party backup software if you want. Purchase that. Again, like I said earlier, make sure you back it up into two different places, the data, either on DVDs, USB drives if you want to back up, maybe an external hard drive, um, and uh, and place it in two different areas and maybe somewhere else and off-site. That's all you really need to work. And make sure you practice restoring. All right, let's get into environmental controls. Methods of preventing the disruption through environmental controls. You need to know how to take care of fire in case there's a fire, proper shielding for the electromagnetic interference, and configuring HVAC systems for air conditioning and ventilations. Okay, so you need to know all three of them. That's very important. So write this down. Let's talk about fire suppression. When it comes to fire, there are three things that you need to worry about. You need to know about actually. Oxygen, heat, and fuel. If there is fire, you have to eliminate one of those three. If you don't have oxygen, then you're not going to have any fire. If you don't have the spark, the heat, you're not going to have any fire, of course. And if there's no fuel, the fire will go. So typically what you want to go out with is get rid of the oxygen. If there's fire, if you immediately suppress the oxygen, the fire immediately will go out. They actually use, so please write that down, those three things, the fire triangle. What will I have to have those chemical fires? They can throw a bomb that can suck all the oxygen out of the air in a room and the fire will just go out immediately. If you're going to use water, make sure it's not an oil. What's the problem when you put oil, when you try to put out a fire that, an oil fire? Because the oil is lighter than water, the fire will go on top of the oil, which the fire will go on top of the water, and if the water starts to move, you're actually spreading the fire from one place to another. So you probably want to use foam, which is lighter than oil, and it will suppress and take out the oxygen, or just cover it with something to kill the oxygen. Don't use water when it comes to oil. So for example, if you have something on your stove and spilling oil and you have fire, you do not want to use water. All right, so water sprinklers, and remember, if you're going to use water with electrical fire, it can cause even more damage. It will, and because water is a semiconductor device, and you most likely are going to short circuit a lot of things, and a lot of electronics are ruined and will be corroded down the road. If you have a flood in your car, that's the one of the biggest problems with flood cars, and insurance companies write them out as um, what do they call them? They take your car completely out because of you know fully damaged, and they'll have to, because the car will no longer be able to be restored. Your car is automatically salvaged if it was in the flood, because most of the electricity or the electronics in your car will be gone. That will be very, very expensive to really put it back together. So you probably want to use foam. And if you have, make sure when it comes to, if you're in the network room, you want to have a chemical type of fire suppressions to put the fire, not water, of course. All right. Please write down these different types of fire. I want you to write down the three different classes, A, B, C, D, and K. I want you to write down what type of fire they are, and the method to extinguish them, right? So if you can create a little table, this is important. This is not only for your network, for your knowledge, but this also could be helpful in everyday's, depending in any type of work that you work at, knowing the different types of things what different types of fires to take care of, right? For example, if it's electrical, you want to use foam or dry chemical or a carbon dioxide to put out the fire. So please write this table down. You don't have to write the last. Well, you could do that if you want to. Why not? What the hell? It's not that big of a deal. But this is an important chart that you should be familiar with. Water sprinklers, for example, could be, you should definitely know, those water sprinklers, if they kick in, are they going to harm any of your sensitive equipment, especially if those water sprinklers should not have any water sprinklers in the network rooms. All right, so that's for fire. When it comes to electromagnetic interference, um, Make sure that your servers are not near. For example, I remember I was working at a company where the servers were close to um, the air conditioning system, and when the air conditioning system kicked in, the servers rebooted, and it was just created a headache because as soon as the air conditioners, those big air conditioners kicked in, they created an electromagnetic interference, and then the operating system just went nuts. So what I actually did, believe it or not, we put a big aluminum piece of metal between them, and that reduced the electromagnetic interference. So we created some sort of a Faraday's cage. Faraday is an electrical engineer that contributed a lot to the electrical engineering environment. I read an article that says Tesla was going to name themselves Faraday instead of Tesla, the car company, because Tesla motors were registered by somebody, and Tesla then decided to buy them out. And if they were unable to do that, they were going to name themselves Faraday instead. Anyway, Faraday's cage is a metal enclosure that prevents the entry or escape of electromagnetic fields. So if you put yourself if you're surrounded by metals, you won't be able to, electromagnetic waves will have a very hard time going in and out of that room. So that's what a Faraday's cage is. If you want and nobody to be able to use their cell phones when they are communicating, if you are in a room, you put them in a Faraday's cage. So if you're working on some sort of high top secret equipment, make sure your lab is surrounded by a Faraday's cage, right? HVAC, that's extremely important in the network room. Make sure that HVAC is there and it's in operational. You have some ventilations, air conditionings, because the servers, routers, switches, all these network equipment are going to be generating a tremendous amount of heat, and you want to have the proper HVAC in there. And if they fail, you want to have some sort of an alert system to let you know that there's a failure and you need your immediate attention, because otherwise it's going to be a big, huge headache, and you don't want that. I remember also I worked at a company where it actually was a pharmaceutical company many, many years ago, where they take off, I think, for 2 weeks near towards the July 4th week. Anyway, in the summer. And wasn't it pharmaceutical? Anyway, I don't know. But it was a small company, and the owner said that we're not gonna turn the air conditioning on, keep it on for the full 2 weeks when we're out of here. So he decided to shut down the air conditioning. And when we came back, the servers, oh my God, it took us about 2 days to bring everything back together because there was so much failures. Never did that again, of course, because of the heat that was generated, and the servers were all over the place, and rebooting, and you had systems that knew there were complete failures. So we had to get everything back together. It took about, lost a lot of production. Took about probably 3 or 4 days to bring everything back to normal. So HVAC is extremely important. You don't want to have a high humidity. You don't want, you want to have some ventilations and things like that. I think it's pretty straightforward when it comes to HVAC. Okay, incident report procedures. What do you do when there is a problem? Okay, this comes to mind. I remember also a test question that came on the Security Plus examination. What do you do if you come in and you see a device that's connected to a port on the switch that's not supposed to be there? What do you do? you don't know who this computer is for, and so on. And you know they're not supposed to be there. Well, I'll tell you the answer immediately. I don't know if I forgot what the other answers are, but the correct answer is to remove the device from that port on the switch, and then investigate and find out who put it there, regardless of who that person may be testing or not. If nobody told you and it's your responsibility that somebody's going to put that port in there, you have to remove it immediately. That information should be in a security policy, by the way, that no one should have access to these servers, to the switches, without your knowledge. All right, back to the incident response procedures. When an unauthorized incident occurs, you have to respond immediately. So what are the basic forensic procedures? This is you are going to become like a detective. You have to analyze the evidence. Computer forensics, you may use technologies to search the computer for evidence of a crime. If you think somebody broke into the network and stole something, so you have to be able to do that. You have to have reasons of importance of the computer forensic, amount of digital evidence, what has been stolen, increased scrutiny of legal profession, higher level of computer skills by criminals. They may use rootkits or some sort of files that can get into even key loggers. If you found them, you need to find out who put it there, what data was stolen. When somebody goes into, for example, just recently, Marriott hotels, they stole, somebody was able to get in there and stole 500 million of their customers' information, including passport, names, emails. So now all the forensic IT professionals got in there and need to find out when this attack happened, how did we know about it, what was taken, all of that, you know. They're working night and day trying to find out all of that information, and they disseminate all of this information back to their customers to let them know that they're working on it and trying to find out exactly what was stolen, right? There are steps that you can take. Here are the 4 steps that you need to follow, and I want you to write them down. How do you exactly perform these tasks? That's something else. Secure the crime scene. Make sure no one else touches it and have access to the device or the server that's been compromised. Collect the evidence. You know, you need to know what evidence. How do you know that somebody actually took anything or stole anything or anything was removed or copied or deleted? Establish a chain of custody means find out exactly something that you can use to in courts to show that there was an attack, right? That's what the chain of custody means. And examine the evidence. Find out exactly what happened, what was taken, what did this software that was sitting on the server doing, and what was it looking for, and how did it capture the data and analyze all of that. And of course, down the road, and you want to use this, of course, in the court. Okay. All right. So we'll take after securing, preserving the evidence, make sure nobody plays around and have access to the system that's been compromised, of course. All right, so that's that. Establishing the chain of custody is evidence maintained under strict control all the time. Examine the evidence, and I think that's it for the chapter. All right, so write down all the points that told you. Okay, upload them as your homework, and we'll meet again for another chapter. So until we meet again, please keep up with the work, and I'll see you then.